Hello, my name is Frank Gorman, and I'm the author of the book that you see on the screen, Confronting Bad History. I'm delighted to be talking about the book before the Civil War Roundtable Congress. I want to thank Mike Movis for all of his help in setting this up. I come to this book after 50 years plus practicing law. I was a trial lawyer for the first 50 years, and then I retired, and that's my state today. But I mainly tried patent, copyright, and trademark cases during the last 30 to 35 years of my career. At the beginning, I did some admiralty and maritime work, tried some of those cases, and generally tried business dispute cases. So it was in 1994 that I was asked to represent Greenmount Cemetery in the lawsuit that had been filed by proponents of the Booth escape justice story. So that's how I come to this point. I live in Baltimore with my wife. We have 3 kids, and I'm honored and graced and blessed to say we have 10 grandkids. So let's start at the beginning with some background. There are going to be 5 parts to this: the background, and then we'll talk about the book, the 1907 book that caused the exhumation trial. And then we'll find out how this history dispute found its way into a court of law. And then fourth, we'll talk about the trial, the witnesses, and there was an appeal to an appellate court. And lastly, we'll look back, a little retrospective on the current developments, some of the motives for writing the book, and those kinds of things, looking back. So with respect to the background, it starts, of course, with one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest president in U.S. history. And I like this first slide because it shows how the war took such a toll on President Lincoln. The picture on your right, well, your left, I think, is the 1863 picture. And then 2 years later, 1865, you see the difference in his demeanor, and he's aged quite a bit in those 2 years. And next is the arch villain, probably the most infamous villain in American history, John Wilkes Booth. And after John Wilkes Booth was captured, brought back to Washington on April 27th, the man in charge was Edward Stanton, which was Lincoln's Secretary of War. He took charge immediately after Lincoln was shot and moved over to the Peterson House. You might wonder, well, why didn't the vice president take charge? And I'll get to that in a moment. But the vice president was not in charge throughout this entire month and beyond that for Lincoln's assassination. It was Secretary of War Stanton who was calling the shots. This is John Wilkes Booth escape route from the Ford's Theater to Garrett Farm, where he was killed on April 26, 1865. I know this audience is familiar with this, so let's move on. At Garrett's Farm, early in the morning of April 26, John Wilkes Booth was captured. He was sleeping in the barn with David Harold, and troops arrived. New York Cavalry, 16th, arrived, and they had a couple of federal detectives with them. Booth would not come out. They set the barn afire. Harold did come out. Booth remained, and he was, of course, on crutches and could not walk well. He was armed, however. And one of the detectives opened the barn door and was beginning to go in amongst the flames and drag him out. But at that instant, one of the soldiers who was looking through the slats of the barn somehow was able to see inside and had his weapon protruding inside, saw the movement of Booth towards the detective and fired a shot. The shot has just about the same angle in the back of the head as Booth's shot that assassinated and killed Lincoln. Ironic. That soldier was a fellow named Boston Corbett. The body was brought back, and overnight it arrived early in the morning in Washington on April 27. One of the things that happened, it was body was taken from the vessel that brought it up to Washington onto a Navy vessel, a Monitor. You've heard about the Monitor and Merrimack ironclads. Well, this was a Monitor, and that's where the autopsy was formed by Surgeon General Barnes, and this is a depiction of that autopsy. During the autopsy, Barnes identified the body as Booth, along with a lot of others. Maybe not as many identifications as you might want today, but there were at least 10 on the vessel who identified John Wilkes Booth. Surgeon General Barnes also took 3 cervical vertebrae and sent them to the newly formed Army Medical Museum in Washington, and they're still there today. The name of the museum has changed. It's the National Museum of History, National Museum of Medicine in Silver Spring, Maryland. The vertebrae are not always on display, but periodically they come up. That night, after the body was taken off the Montauk, it was buried at nighttime at the Washington Arsenal. Washington Arsenal had been the DC penitentiary. The Army took it over in 1863. They used it as they used the arsenal to store ammunition and other military supplies. And Booth was buried in one of the warehouses you see in the background of the arsenal. And here's our President, Andrew Johnson. The reason he was not in charge as soon as he was sworn in, and he was sworn in the following day on April 15, Johnson was brought to the ticket in the 1864 election by Lincoln because he wanted a Southern Democrat. He thought that would help him. Johnson was a difficult man, and he really turned a lot of members of Lincoln's cabinet, including Lincoln himself, against him when he showed up on Inauguration Day drunk and delivered a drunken speech. And it was just a month later when the assassination occurred, and Andrew Johnson didn't have any credibility with the members of the Lincoln cabinet or with Secretary Moore Stanton. But in 1869, at the request of the family, the body was released to an undertaker in Baltimore named John Weaver, and eventually the body was buried in June of 1869 in Greenmount Cemetery at this plot. This is what it looks like today. The obelisk with the word Booth on it was not built for John Wilkes Booth. It was actually built about 30 years later and stood in a different cemetery in Baltimore where John Wilkes Booth's father and his grandfather were buried. When Booth was buried in June of 1869, they brought those bodies over to the plot in Greenmount Cemetery that Mary Ann Booth, the mother of John Wilkes Booth, had purchased. She wanted a family plot, and she brought her husband and her father-in-law to the plot along with this obelisk. Now, rumors occurred because of the secrecy. Keep in mind that everything happened in one day, April 27th. Booth arrives in Washington. By the evening hours, he's buried. So it was very quick, and it caused a lot of suspicions. It caused things like this. This is from Frank Leslie's illustrated magazine, and that came out in May of 1865, purporting to show one of the federal detectives and a soldier dropping Booth's body into the Potomac River. Not true. Also, here's a lady that said that she was on board a vessel that stopped and picked up John Wilkes Booth and took him from Havana to the Bahama Islands. So that was the state of affairs. The traditional story for what happened to Booth was that he was captured, shot, died at Garrett's farm. But in 1907, this changed. A Memphis lawyer named Phineas L. Bates wrote a book, published a book in 1907 called The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth. And you can see the cover here. It talks about the first true account of the Lincoln assassination. It contains a complete confession by Booth. It gives details, shocking details, of the treachery of Andrew Johnson. And he makes no bones about it that this book was written for the correction of history. You can tell all of that from the cover. What's the story of the Bates book? If you go to my website, www.boothcom.com, I have a longer summary of this book. But in a nutshell, Bates says that he was practicing law in 1872 in Texas. He met a man through a representation that he took on named John St. Helen. John St. Helen became sick, thought he was on his deathbed, called for Bates, whispered to Bates from his deathbed, "I'm John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Lincoln." Miraculously, perhaps, John St. Helen recovers. And about a month or two later, Bates asked him to tell him the whole story. Why he says he's Booth. I mean, Bates was skeptical and he wanted to hear the story. So Booth confessed. Bates didn't believe it, but eventually he did come to believe it. And in 1878, they parted company. John St. Helen went west to search for a fortune, probably gold mining and things like that. And Bates came back to his home state of Mississippi and practiced law there until 1890. Then, this is all related in the book. Bates begins to research while he's in Memphis. He has better resources, he says, for finding out about what happened in the assassination. And he thinks he's located John St. Helen. He's not sure, but he thinks he has. And in 1898, he thinks that the $100,000 reward had not yet been given for the capture of John Wilkes Booth, and alive, hopefully. And back then, they wanted him captured alive. So Bates writes to the War Department in 1898 and says, "I have information about where John Wilkes Booth is. Would you be interested?" And the War Department, having already wrapped up the John Wilkes Booth situation, the conspirators' trial had taken care of who was at fault. Of course, people hanged, others were sent down to the Dry Tortugas, Fort Jefferson. So the War Department said no. And then another development in the book, 1903, a man named David E. George in Enid, Oklahoma, on his, well, actually, he poisoned himself, but before he died, he confessed to being John Wilkes Booth. Bates learns about this in 1903 and travels to Enid, Oklahoma, views the body of this guy, David E. George, and proclaims, "This is John St. Helen. And this, therefore, is John Wilkes Booth." And that's pretty much the end of the book. Phineas Bates as I think I mentioned, he moved from Mississippi to Memphis, where he practiced law from 1890 until his death in 1923. And so he went and found David E. George and published his book in 1907 while he was a lawyer in Memphis. Here's the picture that he got of John St. Helen in 1872. Somebody obviously folded it, but that was the picture Bates had. Here's a picture of David E. George. They look the same. Here's a picture of David E. George in 1903 after he had committed suicide. They took a bunch of pictures of him, propped him up with books, and sometimes the eyes are open, but this is a very good shot. You see how long his hand is, and that came up in the trial. Now, continuing with the story, this is not in the Bates book, but it stems from the mummy, or I should say, the corpse that had been preserved in Enid, Oklahoma. Here's a shot of Enid, Oklahoma around 1906. Probably looks pretty much the same as it did in 1903. You see Penniman's. And Penniman had a funeral parlor and a furniture store. They were combined. And Booth's body, David E. George's body, was brought to Penniman's funeral home. And Bates saw it there at that funeral home, Penniman's. Penniman started showing the body. It was on display. People heard of the body of John Wilkes Booth is at the Penniman's furniture store. So people would go down there. And the traffic, as the word spread, lots of people wanted to come. And eventually, after some months, Penniman started charging. And it was a destination, if you were out west, to go to Enid, Oklahoma, and take a look at the mummified remains of John Wilkes Booth. He was embalmed multiple times and became what we call mummified. So eventually, Finis L. Bates got hold of the mummy. He had wanted to get it for Penniman, but Penniman wouldn't release it to him. But finally, around 1917 or thereabouts, Penniman wanted to retire. And so Bates bought it from Penniman and brought the mummy to his home in Memphis, Tennessee. Then he leased it to carnival shows, traveling shows, circuses, because they would have at these kinds of events during those years in the late, I guess I should say the early 1900s. Those traveling carnivals were quite popular, and also unusual exhibits were quite popular. Well, here's a copy of the mummified David E. George, the true embalmed body of John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of our president. And that went around from basically the late 1916, 1917 on until the 1923 when Bates died, and his wife ended up selling it to a carnival show, which continued the exhibit throughout America. Here's a later picture taken in connection with the exhibit of the mummy. And you'll see John Wilkes Booth presented by Finis L. Bates, ex-Attorney General of Tennessee. Well, I talk about fraud later on, but this is the first example. Finis L. Bates was never the Attorney General of Tennessee, but his name was used to attract people to this exhibit. And lastly, on what caused the trial, in the 1970s, there were modern day proponents of the Booth escape justice story. The gentleman on the left is Nathaniel Orlewick. He's still around. He's retired now. He was when he first learned of the Bates story, he saw it in the University of Maryland, where he went to college, library. He read it and became infatuated with it. And he maintained this belief, as expressed by Finest L. Bates in his book, right up to 1994, when the trial papers were filed. The other man on the right next to Orlewick is Arthur Ben Chitty. He too put stock into Bates' book, not as much stock, not as totally convinced as Orlewick was, but Chitty also believed that John Wilkes Booth had escaped and adopted much of the Bates story. And here's the key event. Orlewick and Chitty, from my perspective, pestered, they wouldn't agree with that, but they kept asking Unsolved Mysteries to do an episode based on the escape story. And eventually they did in September 1991. Robert Stack, and his very impressive voice, was the narrator. And this propelled the Bates escape story into the national conscience big time. Prior to this time, the Bates story had ebbed in and out of national consciousness. In the beginning, Bates sold about 70,000 copies of his book over the first 4 or 5 years. That's an estimate. We don't have any hard numbers. But it ebbed in and out of public consciousness. But after the September 1991 Unsolved Mysteries show, it became, I would say, prominent, and certainly in the circles of historians and people interested in history. So now, how did this history dispute, this escape justice story, end up into the law? Well, the story is that after Unsolved Mysteries, Orlewick and Chitty began a letter writing campaign through the assistance of lawyers who came and go from 1991 to 1994, several lawyers, asking / even demanding that the Greenmount Cemetery allow them to come in and exhume the body of John Wilkes Booth from the grave. The president of the cemetery, William Trimble, said no. He thought the history was bad, and he also felt that he had an obligation to Mary Ann Booth and to the entire Booth family to let those in the Booth family plot rest in peace. So as a result, this petition was filed. They reached an impasse, the letter writing stopped, and two people prevailed as the petitioners. They didn't prevail in the lawsuit, but two people filed a petition in court seeking an order from the court requiring Greenmount Cemetery to allow the exhumation of John Wilkes Booth. And in the petition, it was made clear, and I quoted it on this slide, the Bates escape story, that's his book, the 1907 book, is the only escape story with its credibility and persuasiveness intact. It was that book, the 1907 Bates book, that caused this lawsuit to be filed. Actually, the first rendition of the petition had Chitty and Orlewick also as petitioners, but one of the first things we did was knock them out. So the amended petition, which is identical with the first petition, the only change is that Orlewick and Chitty were removed. So when the lawsuit was filed, Bill Trimble, the president of the cemetery, came to me and asked if I would represent them. It wasn't something that I had done before. History cases, going to court is quite rare, but I did agree, and I was happy to take on this case because of its uniqueness. So we went into a period of time of evaluating the case. One of the things we realized is that Chitty and Orlewick did not have any standing. They weren't relatives or next of kin or anything like that, so they didn't belong as petitioners. And we asked the court to throw them off the petition, and the court did. And then, of course, a trial was coming, and we had to line up witnesses. And then we needed to decide, what are we going to present as proof? What will our evidence be? So the evaluation, knockout Orlo and Chitty, which I mentioned, wondering how you try a history case. What do we have to do? Do we put on the real history, the traditional history, or just how do you try a history case? And then also we needed to develop a theme. Every good case that I've tried, and all good lawyers, I should say, they want to have a theme to their case, something the court and the jury can relate to. Lining up expert witnesses. Here we had good help from the Surratt Society. The Surratt House is in Clinton, Maryland, and the Surratt Society grew out of that. Laurie Verge, who since passed away, and James O. Hall, also now deceased, were instrumental in helping Bill Trimble and me identify witnesses who could testify. So we got Michael Kaufman, who was well-known historian on the assassination. Terry Alford, likewise well-known. He was a professor at the Northern Virginia Community College, well-respected. They agreed. They recommended a fellow named Stephen Miller from outside Chicago, who had made his life work as a historian, getting all the information possible on all the soldiers and federal detectives who were at Garrett's farm. And what did they see? What did they believe about who the person was? A large body of important information. They also led to James Hall and Laurie Verge led us to James Starrs, who was a professor of forensic science at the George Washington University. He also was a professor of law at George Washington, and he had lots of experience of exhuming people, like the victims of Alfred Packer, who went through the Donner Pass and was accused of cannibalizing his party. And the last person is William Hanchett, a very distinguished professor of history at the University of San Diego. And he was a scholar, not a historian, a scholar. So we had those witnesses. James O. Hall himself was a prodigious historian with a wide and deep knowledge of the assassination. So he also was a witness for us. And then the theme was really suggested inadvertently. Terry didn't know what he was. Terry just off the cuff mentioned that during one of our meetings, that there were lots of identifications of John Wilkes Booth. And finally, it struck me about a week or two later that that's the theme of our case, of our defense, of our opposition to the exhumation request. There were so many identifications, and what we should prove, what evidence we should present, is evidence of these many identifications of John Wilkes Booth. And we broke it up into three parts. Identifications from the time Ford's Theater, he left Ford's Theater to Garrett Farm. Secondly, all the identifications made at Garrett Farm by the soldiers and detectives and others. And third, identifications made from the time Garrett Farm to burial in Greenmount Cemetery in 1869. So we were ready. The trial started on May 17, 1994. Excuse me, 1995. Petition was filed in 94, and the first day of trial was in May of 1995. So here's the courthouse in Baltimore. It's on Calvert Street. It's familiar to anyone who's lived and worked in the Baltimore metropolitan area, even Washington, D.C. area. If you've tried cases, you probably were in this courthouse at one time or another. And here are the witnesses. The man at the top is Judge Joseph Kaplan, a wonderful judge. He was the chief judge of the Circuit Court for Baltimore City. He's since passed away. if you look at the pictures below, you'll see they're kind of divided subtly into 4 categories, but let's go left to right. The 3 women claim to be Booth relatives, Booth descendants. The gentleman at the bottom of those 3 is the medical examiner for the state of Maryland, and another man named Paul Sledzik, who was from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. Missing on these 5 on the left, the 3 women and the 2 gentlemen below, plus 1 more were the witnesses on the first day. The 1 more who's not pictured here is a fellow named Douglas Uberlacher, who was a very, and still is a very well-known and renowned Smithsonian anthropologist. But when I, over the years, tried to contact him to request permission to use his photo, et cetera, talk to him, he never responded. Even going through intermediaries like Paul Sledzik could not get Mr. Uberlacher to respond. So that's why I'm not using his picture. He did testify, of course. Day 2, Professor Stars, you see him at the podium. We took out of order Professor Stars because so we're still in the petitioner's case, and we interrupted for Stars, and we interrupted for the gentleman at the bottom, Stephen Miller, who I already described to you, who did the research on the soldiers and detectives at Garrett's Farm. The woman on the top is Professor Jean Baker at Goucher College, a Civil War historian, well-known. She wrote a couple of books, one book, probably the definitive book on Martha Lincoln. So the third day, there are 5 witnesses. The first gentleman with the beard is named Gus Russo. He was an expert on the Kennedy assassination, and they brought him in because Lee Harvey Oswald was exhumed. And I think they had him testify to kind of bolster the fact that you can exhume presidential assassins. Then you have Professor Hanchett, and next to him, Orlewick testified. Down below is, with the bow tie, is Bill Trimble. He is still is around, and he was at the time the president of Greenmount Cemetery. And then Michael Kaufman, the historian I mentioned, he was very active in the Surratt Society, gave tours of the escape route. They'd leave the Surratt House, go to Ford's Theater, and then go all the way down to the Garrett Farm location and come back. And Michael would host and monitor and be the guide for those tours. And then on the last day, the 4th day of trial, Trimble came back, testified some more. Kaufman's testimony was finished up. Then to the bottom left of the last segment is Terry Alford, shown there holding the Derringer that Booth used to kill President Lincoln. And then James O. Hall. What a great guy he was. He's you can tell from the smile on his face that he's a guy you want to know and like. So that was the lineup of the witnesses. There were a couple key points. Let me go back. I think Stars testified to a lot of very helpful things, but maybe a turning point. At one point, I asked Stars, why are you, give me all the reasons you're objecting and recommending against this exhumation. And he gave a couple, and then he turned to Judge Kaplan and said, Judge, if you order this exhumation, it will be you ordering an archaeological dig. And he said that because in the Booth family plot in 1995 were a lot of other remains. On top of John Wilkes Booth had been buried, when he was buried in 1869, the remains of 3 small children who did not survive for very long after their birth. And there were others who were buried in the plot. And the cemetery, quite frankly, did not know exactly where in the plot Booth was buried. And that was intentional. Edwin Booth gave instructions to the cemetery to put John Wilkes Booth in an unmarked grave. A key thing that Douglas Uberlacher said the guy this picture is not here, when I asked him, how long will the body be out for you to do your identification work? And he said, 6 months. And Judge Kaplan said, I could see his face kind of wince at 6 months. And where are you going to do this? I'm going to do it in Washington, D.C. So Judge Kaplan would lose jurisdiction or the power over the body of John Wilkes Booth. So there were a lot of others, but there were some key moments in the trial. The decision by Judge Kaplan, who was the trial court judge, was that the exhumation would not be ordered. He believed that the history behind the exhumation was lacking credibility, unpersuasive, and also he believed that the conditions that would make an exhumation for historical purposes justified did not exist. And generally, the law of cemetery law, exhumation law, if you will, is that you just can't get an exhumation on a whim. You have to have a substantial reason. The case was appealed to the Maryland Court of Special Appeals, and a year later, another opinion was issued by a 3-judge court written by Judge Wilner, the chief judge. And on my website, you can get the citations to both of these decisions where you can go read them. Judge Wilner's decision is thorough on the law and also very thorough and a wonderful piece of history. He describes the entire history in very, very well. So both decisions are notable and both decisions are well done. So now we come to part 5. So we're getting to wrap up time. So the title of the book is how this book, this lost cause book and fraudulent book caused the trial. Well, there's fraud in the book, and I'll give you a couple of examples. And of course, this is not Frank Gorman's opinion. This is the opinion of 3 people who testified, James O. Hall, Michael Kaufman, and using the word fraud and fraudulent specifically, and Professor Hanget saying it's a work of fiction. In other words, it's not true. So some examples: Booth broke his right leg. That's what Bates writes. That's what Bates says Booth said. But Booth broke his left leg. And as James O. Hall said, you know, a man who breaks a leg, woman who breaks her leg, is going to remember which leg she broke. Booth did not know of the larger assassination plot. Well, there was a conspiracy trial for all the others who were involved in the assassination plot, trying to kill Stewart, Vice President Johnson, and others. Bates says that Booth claimed he did not know of the assassination plot, but there's lots of evidence that he did know, that indeed he was the organizer. Another statement, Bates says Booth arrived in Washington on April 14, that he had been scouting out escape routes for the plan to have Lincoln swapped for Confederate prisoners. That was the plan Booth had with his conspirators to kidnap President Lincoln and then exchange Lincoln for Confederate war prisoners. And Bates says that Booth said that he arrived in Washington on April 14, the day of the assassination. It's not true. There's lots of evidence he was there on the 11th, 12th, 13th of April. And lastly, Bates says that Booth did not know that Lee surrendered until April 14, the day he arrived in Washington. Lee surrendered on April 9, and it's just inconceivable that someone who was trying to plan a kidnap and a prisoner swap between Lincoln and Confederate soldiers would not know a few days at least after April 9 that Lee had surrendered. And also, it's a lost cause narrative. The lost cause is something that became very prominent in the early 20th century, the early 1900s, the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the monuments that were put up, etc. But it also became prominent after the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning that's still going on in this country. And the main proponents of the lost cause, which was developed back in the 1880s, 1890s, was that slavery was a benevolent institution. The slaves were happy, everything was fine, the North shouldn't have interfered. And two, the cause of the Civil War was the slavery issue, or not. The lost cause says not. And third, Southern states had the right to succeed. It was a constitutional issue. So the war was fought over constitutional issues. That's all part of the lost cause. And if you look at the book and read it carefully, as I have many times, Bates romanticizes Booth, calling him a man of gentle breeding, culture, refinement, beautiful sentiment, modest, unobtrusive, gentle, respectful, his friend, a born genius of high cultivation. All of these praises of Booth, romanticizing him for, it's not an excuse, I guess it was in terms of an explanation of the deadliest political assassination in this country. So it's a lost cause, false narrative. Why did Bates write the book? I have a section in the book about that. And there are a number of motivations. I can't pinpoint one, but I think one of them is money. Bates was looking for money in the later years of his life, from, I'd say, 1900 on. He was looking for ways to make money other than practicing law. And then the most recent development is DNA. Now, the petition in 1994 said they would do DNA for identification purposes. But when the trial started, they admitted they couldn't do DNA and they weren't going to even try. The way they did DNA back then is you needed matrilineal DNA. You needed a DNA strain from the mother or somebody on the mother's line to compare with the person you're trying to identify. And they didn't have that. I guess they could have suggested exhuming the body of Mary Ann Booth, who is buried there in the Greenmount Cemetery plot, but I don't think they were going to go that far. So they couldn't do DNA, but today they can do DNA. Today, the method for DNA has changed. It's no longer identical, one-to-one comparison. You take the whole human gene sequence of each person, the known person and the person you're trying to identify. And if you have a sample that has their DNA, it's a long, thousands of characters of markers, and that DNA sequencing is compared one to the other. And if statistically there's a match for, say, anything at 92, 93, 95, a high match, a high percentage of identical genomes, then they will proclaim that this person or these two people are related to each other. And that method was used on a History Channel show that was aired in December 2020. And you'll see that several people who claim to be Booth descendants were knocked out using this DNA test. So today, a lot of people still promote the Booth escape justice story. I've given you some examples. Some of them go as recently as 2023. I haven't checked in the past year. But the story is still out there, despite the trial. And so my conclusion is too little is known about the trial and the overwhelming evidence that was produced that Booth did not escape capture and death. As it came up during the trial, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what Terry Offord testified to. The real history, Booth was captured, shot, and died on April 26, at Garrett Farm. Thank you very much. I was involved because I represented the cemetery. The law firm I was with was Gorman and Williams. Here's the book and my website. You can get information there. And as I mentioned, it's available in retail and soon will be in bookstores. Thank you very much. I hope you all have a good day and a good evening.